4 days. That's all it took. 4 days to turn the tide of an entire theater of war. 4 days to destroy what Hitler called his most elite fighting force. 4 days to rack up a body count so staggering that it still makes military historians pause in disbelief. 150,000 Germans. Dead, wounded, or captured. In 96 hours. And the man who did it? The man who orchestrated this symphony of destruction? General George Patton called him too cautious. General Omar Bradley dismissed him as overcautious. Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, his own mentor, criticized his slow approach. They were all wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. His name was Guy Simonds. You've probably never heard of him. Most people haven't. He's the forgotten general, the commander history left behind while it showered glory on the Americans and British. Canadian. Quiet. Methodical. Boring, some said. But when he finally unleashed hell in August 1944, what he created was something the German Wehrmacht had never experienced before, not even on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. He turned the Falaise Pocket into a slaughterhouse so complete, so total, that German survivors called it the corridor of death. They weren't exaggerating. This is the story of how the most underestimated general of World War II became the architect of Germany's worst defeat in the West. This is the story of how being called too cautious saved thousands of Allied lives while ending hundreds of thousands of German ones. This is the story of Guy Simonds and the 4 days that changed everything. Let's go back to where this all began. Normandy, July 1944. The Allies had landed on D-Day 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks of brutal fighting, of hedgerows and mud and blood. 6 weeks of grinding, painful progress measured in yards, not miles. The Americans were stuck in the bocage country, those nightmare hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. The British and Canadians were hammering against Caen, the city that was supposed to fall on D-Day but was still holding out a month and a half later. And everyone was getting frustrated. The grand plan, the master strategy that was supposed to liberate France in weeks, was turning into a nightmare of attrition. Eisenhower was worried. Churchill was worried. The newspapers back home were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Why was it taking so long? Why weren't they moving faster? Where were the lightning advances everyone had promised? That's when the whispers started about Guy Simonds. At 41 years old, he was one of the youngest corps commanders in the entire Allied army. He commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps, and he was responsible for some of the bloodiest fighting in Normandy. His divisions were taking horrific casualties trying to break through the German defenses south of Caen. And he was doing it slowly, methodically, carefully. Too carefully, said his critics. Patton heard the reports about Simonds and scoffed. Patton, who believed in speed and aggression and taking risks, couldn't understand this Canadian who planned everything down to the last detail. Bradley agreed. Even Montgomery, who had personally selected Simonds and trained him, was starting to wonder if his protégé had lost his nerve. They didn't understand. They couldn't see what Simonds saw. Because Guy Simonds had a secret. He had learned something that most Allied commanders hadn't figured out yet, something that would save thousands of lives and win the war in France. He had learned that the Germans were different now. The Wehrmacht of 1944 wasn't the Wehrmacht of 1940. They had been bloodied in Russia. They had lost their best men. But they had also learned how to defend. They had become masters of defensive warfare, experts at making every attack cost as much blood as possible. And Simonds had figured out how to beat them at their own game. Not with speed. Not with aggression. With science. With mathematics. With cold, calculated violence applied with precision. He studied every battle, analyzed every attack. He looked at the casualty figures, the success rates, the ground gained per soldier lost. And he came to a conclusion that horrified him but that he knew was true. The conventional way of attacking, the way everyone else was doing it, was throwing away lives for nothing. Infantry assaults against prepared positions were suicide. Tank charges against anti-tank guns were murder. The Germans had learned how to make attackers pay in blood, and the Allies were paying that price over and over again. So Simonds decided to change the rules. He started innovating, experimenting, thinking in ways that made the traditionalists uncomfortable. He stripped the guns out of old M7 self-propelled artillery vehicles and turned them into armored personnel carriers, the first true APCs in history. He created massive artillery bombardments that were synchronized down to the second. He developed night attacks using searchlights bounced off clouds to create artificial moonlight. He combined arms in ways no one had tried before. And everyone thought he was being too cautious, too slow, too methodical. His fellow commanders didn't see the genius. They just saw a man who wouldn't attack until everything was perfect. They saw endless planning meetings. They saw delays and postponements. They saw a general who seemed more interested in logistics than fighting. But the soldiers who served under Simonds? They knew better. They knew that when Simonds attacked they would come back alive. They knew that he never wasted lives. They knew that every casualty had a purpose. Every death moved them closer to victory. They called him cold, calculating, emotionless. And they loved him for it because he brought them home. Now let's jump forward to early August 1944. The situation had changed. The Americans had finally broken out at St. Lo. Patton was racing through Brittany, cutting east toward the Seine. The German armies in Normandy were suddenly in danger. Hitler, in one of his increasingly delusional strategic decisions, ordered a counterattack at Mortain to cut off the American breakthrough. It was a disaster. The Americans held. And suddenly the Germans had stuck their head into a noose. The Falaise Gap. That's what it became known as. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, along with remnants of Panzer Group West, were trapped in a pocket between the advancing Americans from the south and the British and Canadians from the north. If the Allies could close the gap, they could trap hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. They could destroy 2 entire armies. They could end the war in France in one stroke. And the job of closing the northern jaw of that trap fell to Guy Simonds and his 2nd Canadian Corps. This was it. This was the moment everything had been building toward. All those careful preparations, all that methodical planning, all those innovations and experiments. Everything was about to pay off. But first, Simonds had to get through the most formidable defensive position in Normandy, the Verrières Ridge. A long, low ridge south of Caen that the Germans had turned into a fortress. Multiple SS Panzer divisions were dug in there. The Hitler Youth Division. The Leibstandard. Veterans of the Eastern Front who knew every trick of defensive warfare. They had turned that ridge into a killing ground. Previous attacks on Verrières had been disasters. Operation Spring in late July had cost the Canadians nearly 400 dead in a single day. The Germans were ready. They knew the Allies had to attack south from Caen. They knew the roads, the terrain, the angles of fire. They had months to prepare and they had prepared well. Simonds studied the ridge. He studied the failures. He calculated the odds. And he designed Operation Totalize. What he created was revolutionary. He was going to attack at night, something almost unheard of for an armored attack. He was going to use bombers in close support of ground troops, dropping their payloads just ahead of the advancing armor. He was going to put his infantry inside those converted priests, keeping them safe from artillery until the last possible moment. He was going to use a rolling artillery barrage that would move forward on a precise timetable, creating a wall of steel that would sweep everything before it. And he was going to do all of this with Canadian, Polish and British troops who had already been bled white in the fighting around Caen. Troops that everyone said were exhausted, worn out, finished as fighting forces. Troops that hadn't had a real victory in weeks. The attack was scheduled for the night of August 7th into August 8th. Simonds briefed his commanders. He explained the plan in meticulous detail. Every unit had its role. Every tank had its position. Every artillery piece had its schedule. Nothing was left to chance. And when he was done, do you know what the other generals said? They said he was overcomplicating things. They said night attacks were too risky. They said the planning was too elaborate, that it would fall apart as soon as contact was made with the enemy. Montgomery, sitting in his headquarters, had doubts. Patton, racing across France, laughed when he heard about the night attack. Too cautious Simonds trying to be clever. Bradley shook his head. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. August 7th, 1944. Night was falling over Normandy. The sun set behind clouds of dust and smoke from the day's fighting. Along the start line south of Caen, thousands of men were checking their equipment one last time. Tank crews were buttoning up their vehicles. Artillery crews were loading shells. Infantry were climbing into the strange converted priests that would carry them into battle. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the night exploded. 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was beyond description. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical force that shook the ground and compressed the air and seemed to make the very sky vibrate. Shell after shell, pouring down on the German positions. High explosives. White phosphorus. Smoke rounds creating a curtain that hid the advancing forces. And then the bombers came. RAF heavy bombers, dropping 1,000-pound bombs just ahead of the advancing armor. The Germans, already stunned by the artillery, now faced devastation from above. Their communications were cut. Their bunkers collapsed. Their carefully prepared positions disappeared in explosions. Behind that wall of fire and steel, Simonds's force advanced. Columns of tanks and infantry carriers moving forward in the darkness, following paths marked by tracer bullets fired over their heads. Radio silence. No lights. Just the rumble of engines and the crunch of tracks on earth and the distant thunder of the bombardment ahead. The Germans never knew what hit them. They were expecting a dawn attack. They were ready for daylight, for the usual pattern of Allied operations. Instead, they got apocalypse at midnight. Their forward positions were overrun before they could react. Their anti-tank guns were crushed by tanks they never saw coming. Their infantry were killed in their trenches by the following waves of armor. By dawn, Simonds's forces had penetrated 7 miles into the German defenses. 7 miles. In one night. Something that had taken weeks before was accomplished in hours. The Verriers Ridge, that fortress that had cost so many lives, was bypassed and taken from the rear. The SS divisions that had held it were scattered, broken, retreating in confusion. But Simonds wasn't done. Not even close. The next phase of Totalize ran into problems. Friendly fire from American bombers hitting Canadian positions. German reserves counterattacking. Delays and confusion as the rapid advance outran its supply lines. The attack stalled short of Falaise, the key town that was the objective. Montgomery was disappointed. Patton was dismissive. See, they said, Simonds had been too cautious in his planning, hadn't pushed hard enough. If only he had been more aggressive, more willing to take risks. They didn't understand that Simonds had just created the conditions for something far bigger than taking one town. He had broken the German defenses. He had proven that the Wehrmacht could be destroyed, not just pushed back. He had created a gap in the German lines that was starting to become a rout. Because while Totalize was battering south toward Falaise, the Americans were racing north from the opposite direction. Patton's Third Army was cutting behind the German forces, driving east and then hooking north. The Falaise Pocket was forming. And the Germans inside were starting to panic. Simonds regrouped. He launched Operation Tractable on August 14th, another massive assault toward Falaise. This time he refined his methods even further. More smoke. Better coordination. Lessons learned from Totalize applied immediately. The town fell on August 16th. The northern jaw of the trap was closing. And then the real killing began. The Falaise Pocket in mid-August 1944 was hell on earth. Imagine this. Take 2 entire German armies, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, tanks, supply trucks. Compress them into a space about 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Surround them with Allied forces. And then pour fire into them from every direction. That's what happened. The Americans held the southern edge. The British held the western edge. The Canadians and Poles held the northern edge. And the French and Americans were racing to close the gap at the eastern end. The Germans inside were trapped. And Simonds, that cautious, methodical, overcautious commander, unleashed everything he had. Every artillery piece in the 2nd Canadian Corps opened fire. Not at specific targets. At areas. At grid squares. At anywhere German forces might be. Thousands of shells per hour, day and night, without pause. The sound never stopped. It was a constant roar of explosions that went on for days. The RAF and USAF flew missions around the clock. Fighters and fighter bombers, diving down to strafe and bomb anything that moved. Spitfires and Typhoons and Mustangs hunting German columns on every road and track. The pilots couldn't miss. The targets were everywhere. Every attack found Germans, killed Germans, destroyed German equipment. The ground forces pushed in from all sides. Not quickly. Not recklessly. But inexorably. Steadily. Like a vice closing. Every hour the pocket got smaller. Every hour more German units were crushed against each other. Every hour the casualties mounted. The Germans tried to escape. They tried everything. They attacked at night. They infiltrated in small groups. They abandoned their heavy equipment and tried to slip through on foot. Some made it. Maybe 20,000. Maybe 30,000. But the rest? The rest died or surrendered or were wounded so badly they wished they had died. The roads became impassable. Not because they were destroyed but because they were clogged with wrecked vehicles and dead horses and bodies. Thousands of bodies. Tanks pushed burning trucks off the road to make way for more tanks. Infantrymen climbed over piles of German dead to reach their objectives. The smell was beyond description. Blood and cordite and burning flesh and death. So much death. August 17th. August 18th. August 19th. August 20th. 4 days of pure destruction. 4 days where the killing never stopped. 4 days where the number of German casualties climbed to numbers that seemed impossible. The Hitler Youth Division? Destroyed. Of the 20,000 men who started the Normandy campaign, Fewer than 500 escaped the pocket. The Leibstandard? Shattered. The 12th SS Panzer Division? Ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Entire infantry divisions were wiped out. Not defeated. Not pushed back. Annihilated. And Guy Simonds, sitting in his headquarters, tracking the battle on his maps, calculating the casualties, adjusting the artillery fire patterns, never stopped. He was doing what he had always done. Applying violence with mathematical precision. Making every shell count. Making every attack achieve its purpose. Being cautious with his own men's lives while being utterly ruthless with the enemy. The Poles reached Chambois on August 19, linking up with American forces. The trap was closed. The Germans still inside had nowhere to go. Some surrendered. Many died trying to fight their way out. But the result was the same. When it was over, when the shooting finally stopped and they counted the bodies and the prisoners, the numbers were staggering. 50,000 Germans dead. 10,000 vehicles destroyed. Over 100,000 captured. Some estimates put the total casualties, including wounded, at over 150,000. 150,000. In 4 days. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army ceased to exist. Not as a figure of speech. They actually ceased to exist as military formations. They had to be rebuilt from scratch with new men, new equipment, new commanders. The Wehrmacht in France was broken. The road to the Seine was open. The road to Paris was open. The road to the German border was open. And it had all happened because the most cautious general in the Allied army had finally been unleashed to do what he did best. Destroy the enemy with clinical, methodical, unstoppable precision. But here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. Do you know how many casualties Simonds's corps took during those 4 days? During the closing of the Falaise Pocket? Fewer than 5,000. Fewer than 5,000 Allied casualties to inflict more than 150,000 German casualties. A casualty exchange ratio of 30-1. Let that sink in. 30 Germans killed, wounded, or captured for every Allied casualty. In offensive operations. Against prepared defenses. Against SS divisions that were considered the elite of the German military. Patton's operations? Spectacular, but his casualty ratios were nowhere near that favorable. Bradley's forces? They did well but not like that. Montgomery's British troops? Good but not at those numbers. Simonds achieved something that no other Allied commander managed in the entire war. He figured out how to break the German army without breaking his own. He solved the equation of modern warfare. He proved that with proper planning, with innovation, with willingness to try new methods, you could win decisively while preserving your own forces. And yet, when the war ended, when the histories were written, when the glory was handed out, Guy Simonds was forgotten. The Americans celebrated Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower. The British celebrated Montgomery. The Soviets celebrated Zhukov. Canada? Canada barely mentioned Simonds. What? Part of it was politics. Canada was a smaller country. Its contributions were overlooked in the grand narrative. Part of it was personality. Simonds was cold, distant, hard to like. He didn't give good quotes. He didn't have colorful nicknames. He wasn't good for newspapers or newsreels. But mostly it was because what Simonds did was too cold, too calculated, too much like mathematics instead of heroism. People wanted to hear about bold tank commanders racing across France. They wanted to hear about brave infantry charges and desperate last stands. They didn't want to hear about a general who sat in his headquarters running calculations and planning artillery schedules. Even after Falaise, the criticism continued. Patton said the gap should have been closed sooner. Montgomery said Simonds should have pushed harder. Historians argued about whether the Germans could have been trapped more completely. Everyone had opinions about what Simonds should have done differently. But none of them, not one of them, could match what he actually did. None of them killed 150,000 Germans in 4 days. None of them broke 2 entire armies. None of them achieved casualty ratios of 30-1. Let's talk about what happened after Falaise, because Simonds's war wasn't over. After the pocket closed, after the German armies in France were destroyed, the Allies raced east. The dash across France, everyone running toward the German border. And Simonds? He kept doing what he did best. The Canadians were given the job of clearing the Channel ports. Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk. The Germans had turned these into fortresses, heavily defended, stocked for months of fighting. Everyone expected long sieges, bloody urban combat, high casualties. Simonds looked at each one, planned his attacks, and systematically crushed them. He used the same methods as at Falaise. Massive artillery bombardments. Air support coordinated down to the minute. Infantry carried in armored vehicles. Nothing left to chance. And the ports fell one by one, faster than anyone predicted, with lower casualties than anyone expected. Then came the Scheldt estuary. This was supposed to be the nightmare battle. The approaches to Antwerp, the port the Allies desperately needed to supply their advance into Germany. The Germans had flooded the polders, turned the area into a maze of waterways and islands and mud. They had fortified every position. They were determined to hold. The Scheldt campaign took 6 weeks. It was brutal. Fighting in waist-deep water. Attacking across open ground with no cover. Assaulting bunkers and pillboxes and strongpoints. It cost Simonds's corps heavy casualties. It was the kind of grinding, miserable warfare that World War I veterans recognized. But Simonds won. He cleared the Scheldt. He opened Antwerp. And he did it with casualties that, while heavy, were far lower than they should have been. Because even in the worst conditions, even when there was no clever solution, no innovative technique that could help, he never wasted lives. He never ordered attacks that weren't necessary. He never sacrificed men just to meet a deadline or please his superiors. The war continued. The Canadians fought their way into the Netherlands. They fought through the winter. They participated in the final offensives into Germany. And throughout it all, Simonds commanded with the same cold efficiency that had characterized his entire career. His casualty rates remained lower than comparable Allied formations. His success rate remained higher. He trained his subordinates, developed his officers, built the Canadian Army into one of the most effective fighting forces in the Allied coalition. And still people called him too cautious. After the war ended, Simonds stayed in the military. He became chief of the General Staff of the Canadian Army. He modernized the force. He created training programs based on his wartime experiences. He wrote doctrinal manuals. He influenced a generation of Canadian officers. But he never got the recognition he deserved. He never became a household name. When people talked about great generals of World War II, his name didn't come up. The Falaise Pocket was remembered, but as a collective Allied victory, not as Simonds's triumph. He retired in the 1960s. Wrote some articles. Gave some interviews. But mostly he disappeared from public view. He died in 1974, and his death barely made the news. The general who killed 150,000 Germans in 4 days, the man who helped win the war in France, died in obscurity. Here's what makes this story important, though. It's not just about one forgotten general. It's about how we remember war. How we choose our heroes. How we tell our stories. We love the bold generals. The aggressive commanders. The men who took risks and won glory. We love Patton racing across France. We love Montgomery's careful set-piece battles. We love the drama, the personality, the colorful quotes, and the bold actions. But we forget the Guy Simondses of the world. The cautious generals who saved lives. The calculating commanders who won battles with mathematics instead of heroism. The men who weren't good for movies or books because they didn't give us the stories we wanted to hear. And that's our loss. Because Simonds represents something important. He represents the idea that in war, the best general isn't always the boldest one. Sometimes the best general is the one who thinks harder, plans better, and values his soldiers' lives enough to fight smart instead of fighting hard. Think about this. If every Allied general had fought like Simonds, how many lives would have been saved? If every attack had been planned as carefully, coordinated as precisely, executed as methodically? Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? But they didn't. Because fighting like Simonds required patience. It required accepting that you would be criticized, called slow, called overcautious. It required having the strength to ignore your critics and stick to your principles even when everyone around you was demanding faster action. That's harder than charging forward. That's harder than taking risks. It's easier to be bold than to be smart. It's easier to attack now than to wait for the perfect moment. Simonds waited. He planned. He calculated. And when he finally struck, he struck with such precision and power that the enemy didn't just lose, they were annihilated. The irony is perfect. The general everyone called too cautious became the most destructive Allied commander in France. The man who was criticized for being slow orchestrated the fastest collapse of a German army in the entire Western Front. The commander who everyone said wouldn't take risks ended up taking the biggest risks of all, betting everything on innovative tactics that had never been tried before. And he won. Every time. Not with luck. Not with superior numbers. Not with divine intervention. With science. With planning. With cold, ruthless intelligence applied to the problem of destroying an enemy army. That's the real lesson of Guy Simonds. That's what we should remember. In war, as in everything else, the smartest person in the room often looks like the most cautious. The person willing to wait for the right moment often looks like they're afraid to act. The person who plans thoroughly often looks like they're overthinking things. Until the moment comes. Until the plan unfolds. Until the results are counted. And then everyone realizes that what looked like caution was actually wisdom. What looked like overthinking was actually genius. What looked like fear was actually courage of a different kind, the courage to do what was right instead of what was popular. Patton got his glory. Bradley got his reputation. Montgomery got his fame. And Simonds? Simonds got results. 150,000 German casualties in 4 days. The destruction of 2 armies. The opening of the road to victory. So the next time someone tells you a story about a great general, about a bold commander, about a heroic leader who took risks and won glory, remember Guy Simonds. Remember the quiet Canadian who everyone called too cautious. Remember the man who killed more Germans in 4 days than most generals killed in months. Remember that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't look like heroes at all. They look like mathematicians. Like planners. Like cautious, overcautious, too cautious soldiers who care more about winning than about glory. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not how bold you are. Not how aggressive you are. But whether you win. Whether you accomplish the mission. Whether you bring your soldiers home. And by that measure, Guy Simonds was one of the greatest generals of World War II. Even if Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery never admitted it. Even if history forgot him. Even if his name is unknown to most people today. The 150,000 Germans who died in those 4 days in August 1944? They knew. They knew exactly how dangerous the cautious general could be. They learned the hard way that sometimes the most terrifying enemy is the one who thinks before he acts, who plans before he attacks, who calculates every move and never makes a mistake. That was Guy Simonds. The forgotten general. The overcautious commander. The man who destroyed armies while everyone called him slow. The genius that history overlooked. And 4 days in August 1944? Those 4 days proved what he had known all along. That being cautious wasn't weakness. It was the deadliest form of strength. That taking your time wasn't cowardice. It was the smartest kind of courage. That thinking carefully wasn't hesitation. It was the key to total victory. 150,000 Germans in 4 days. Remember that number. Remember the Falaise Pocket. Remember what happens when intelligence and patience and ruthless determination combine in one man. Remember Guy Simonds.